The pod smelled like burning wire and recycled air, and I was already writing the report. My name is Mara Voss, Staff Sergeant Merchant Defense Corps, assigned to the freighter Endurance. I say was because the Endurance no longer existed. 3 minutes ago, it was a working cargo ship. Now it was a cloud of metal fragments, slowly spreading across the dark between stars. And I was sitting in a survival pod roughly the size of a closet, watching the whole thing through a cracked viewport. I had a cut above my left ear where I had hit the bulkhead during the explosion. I had a broken thumbnail from jamming it into the emergency release on the pod hatch. I had 48 hours of oxygen, a tablet with a cracked screen, and one protein bar that I was fairly certain had expired 6 months ago. What I did not have was time to fall apart, so I opened the tablet and started typing. The alien ship was still there. I could see it through the viewport, a crescent-shaped thing, 6 kilometers from end to end, black as a closed eye, catching no light at all. It had appeared out of nowhere, no hail, no approach signal, nothing. 1 second, the Endurance was running a routine cargo run between the Jupiter stations and the outer belt. The next second, a beam of something I had never seen before hit the ship amidships and took it apart in a single breath. I had made it to the pod because I was already suited up for an external inspection. Lucky, or unlucky, depending on how you thought about the next 48 hours. The alien ship did not leave. It held position. I watched it the way you watch a large dog that has not decided what it thinks of you yet. Then the comm crackled. The voice that came through the speaker was not quite human, but it was speaking English. Carefully, precisely, the way a person speaks a language they have studied but never truly loved. The words were correct. The meaning behind them was not interested in being kind. "Attention, survival unit," the voice said. "You are speaking with Admiral Ven Karath of the Dominion Advance Fleet. Your vessel has been catalogued and removed as an obstruction. Your species has been assessed. Classification, Class 2 nuisance, recommended action, systematic reduction. You are being informed as a courtesy. No response is necessary." I remember thinking that the translator must be very good, because it managed to make courtesy sound like an insult. "Systematic reduction," I said out loud to nobody. I wrote it down on the tablet. There was a pause. I think they expected silence, or crying, or a burst of radio static as I tried to send a distress call that nobody would receive in time. I did not do any of those things. I pulled up the structural assessment I had started before everything went sideways and added a new section at the top. I noted the type of beam weapon, the charge cycle I had observed before it fired, the approximate range, the way the Endurance had come apart. Aft section first, which told me something about where the beam had actually hit. Old habit, soldiers make notes. I was a decent one. The comm crackled again, and this time there was a visual feed. The face on the screen was not human. The Admiral looked something like a lizard that had decided to grow too tall and too thin, with flat pale eyes and a ridge of dark scales running from the top of the skull down to the neck. He was wearing what I assumed was a dress uniform, layered and dark, with geometric markings on the shoulder that I had no framework to read. He looked at me the way you look at a small rock you have just noticed on your doorstep. "You are recording," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "There is no one to send it to." "There will be," I said. He looked at me for a moment longer. Something shifted in his expression, not respect. More like you might look at an insect that has just done something unexpected. Mild curiosity. He was already bored with it. "Your species occupies 3-star systems," he said. "Your fastest military vessel is a converted transport with 2 forward guns. You have no faster-than-light weapons capability. You have no allies in recognized galactic space. You are, by every measurable standard, not a threat." "Then why are you telling me all of this?" I asked. That gave him a fraction of a pause. "Just a fraction. Protocol," he said. "We inform. It is more civilized than simply acting." I looked at the cloud of metal outside the viewport that had been my ship 12 minutes ago and decided not to comment on that. I finished the sentence I was typing. I looked up at the screen. "Is there anything else?" I asked. "You may use your remaining time however you wish," the Admiral said. "It is not our custom to interfere with last moments. We are not without grace." I nodded slowly. I thought about the 23 crew members of the Endurance who had not made it to escape pods. I thought about Karen, the second mate, who made terrible coffee and always had a card game running in the break room. I thought about old Pete Donnell, the chief engineer, who had 3 grandchildren, and a photograph of them taped to the inside of his locker door. I thought about a lot of things in about 4 seconds. Then I looked at the Admiral and I said, "Congratulations. You just started a war you cannot win." The screen went quiet. The Admiral did not laugh immediately. He processed it first, the way you process a joke told in a foreign language. searching for the part where it becomes funny. Then the laugh came, low and slow, like something turning over in a deep engine room. Two officers behind him made sounds I could not identify but which translated clearly enough in context. "You are one person," he said in a Bach. "Yes," I said. "And I am writing everything down." He looked at me for 3 more seconds. Then the screen went dark. I sat back in the pod chair and listened to the hum of the recyclers and the distant cooling tick of the hull. My hands were not shaking. I noted that with something like professional satisfaction. Then I kept writing. The thing about being a soldier, the real thing that nobody tells you until you have been one long enough, is that fear does not go away. It does not dissolve into courage the way stories suggest. What actually happens is that the brain finds a task and locks onto it, and for as long as the task exists, the fear has nowhere to sit. My task was the report. So the fear stood outside the door and waited, and I typed. I noted the physical dimensions of the alien vessel as best I could estimate them. I noted the color, or rather the absence of color, and the way it reflected nothing, not even starlight, which suggested an absorptive hull material I had no name for. I noted the weapon discharge signature, the charge time, the single-shot elimination of a vessel roughly 400 meters long. I noted the language capability, the translator technology, the fact that they had studied English specifically, which meant they had been watching us. For how long I did not know, long enough. I noted the admiral's title, his name as I had heard it, his rank insignia as best I could describe it. I noted the 2 officers behind him, their positions, their apparent deference. I noted that the admiral had answered my question about why he was speaking to me at all. Protocol, he had said. That meant there was a system. Systems had rules. Rules had edges. Edges could be found and pressed. I noted that he had not destroyed the pod. That was interesting. I noted it twice. Outside the viewport, the debris of the Endurance continued its slow, quiet spread across the dark. Somewhere in it was Karen's coffee thermos, probably. Somewhere in it was Pete Donnell's photograph. I made a line in the report and I wrote their names. And then I wrote the names of every other crew member I could remember, which was all 23 of them, because a good soldier knows who she is responsible for. Then I set the distress beacon to pulse on a tight frequency toward the inner system relay, leaned my head back against the headrest, and waited. The protein bar was in fact terrible. I ate half of it and saved the other half, because that is also what soldiers do. 14 hours later, a deep-range cutter from the Jupiter Defense Station found the pod. The young lieutenant who opened the hatch looked at me with the wide eyes of someone who had expected to find a body and instead found a woman typing on a broken tablet. "Surgeon Voss," he said. "The report is almost done," I said. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then said the only sensible thing available to him in that moment. "Yes, ma'am." I finished the last paragraph on the way back to the station. By the time we docked, the distress beacon had already forwarded the fragments of my transmission, including the Admiral's words, to every defense coordination channel in the inner system. By the time I walked off the cutter and onto the station deck, 3 generals and a government liaison were waiting for me. The government liaison was already talking before I reached him, something about verification and protocol, and the sensitivity of the situation. I handed him my tablet. "It is all in the report," I said. He looked at the cracked screen, the 40-page document, the 23 names at the bottom. "We'll need to debrief you," he said. "Of course," I said. I pressed my thumbnail, the broken one, into my palm and breathed through the sting of it, just to stay present, just to stay in the room and not somewhere back in that expanding cloud of metal and silence. After the debrief, I said, "I would like to know what we are going to do about this." The generals looked at each other. The liaison cleared his throat. Nobody had a clean answer. I had expected that. I had already started working on the next section of the report. That was the beginning. Later, when people talked about the war, when they wrote the histories, when they made the documentaries and the lectures and the long, serious analyses, they always started with the political response, or the military mobilization, or the first fleet engagement. They started with the big things. I always thought they started in the wrong place. The beginning was a pod, a cracked tablet, a protein bar that tasted like cardboard and disappointment, and a woman who was too tired and too angry and too trained to do anything except write it all down and keep going. The Admiral had been right about one thing. I was one person in a box. He had been wrong about what that meant. The Hegemony Council Chamber was a sphere large enough to hold a small city, and it smelled like 37 different kinds of atmosphere, all trying to coexist in the same room. I noticed the smell before I noticed anything else, because it was the kind of thing your body registers before your brain catches up. Not unpleasant, just deeply, completely alien. like standing in a greenhouse that had been designed by a committee that had never seen a plant. My name is Mara Voss, and 6 weeks after floating in an escape pod above the debris of my own ship, I was standing on a floating platform in the center of the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, wearing my dress uniform, which I had pressed twice the night before, and still could not get the left shoulder seam to sit correctly. Nobody had invited humanity to the Hegemony Council. We had not known it existed until 4 weeks before this meeting, when the galactic diplomatic channels, which we had also not known existed, opened a formal line to Earth's government with a single message. It said, roughly translated, that the Council was aware of the recent incident involving a Karath Dominion vessel and a human freighter, that the Council wished to address the matter, and that a human representative would be permitted to attend a session as a non-voting observer. Non-voting observer. I read that twice when the liaison showed it to me. They want to watch us be told our situation, I said. That is not exactly how the diplomatic team is framing it, the liaison said. How are they framing it? He paused. As an opportunity, it is both, I said. The question is which one we decide to use. I was not supposed to be the representative. There were diplomats, people trained for rooms like this. People who knew how to stand still and speak carefully, and not say things that caused interstellar incidents. The problem was that every diplomat we had spoke to the situation from a position of theory, because until 6 weeks ago, none of us had met anyone from beyond our own solar system. None of them had been in the pod. None of them had looked at Admiral Venkarath's flat, pale eyes and heard the words systematic reduction delivered like a weather forecast. I had, and when the generals and the council and the long serious meetings had run their course, the decision came back to me because I was the only human alive who had spoken directly to a Karath officer and not said something regrettable. You are going to represent humanity, the head of Earth's Defense Council told me, not as a soldier, as a witness. What's the difference, I asked. A soldier argues, he said. A witness tells the truth. Those aren't mutually exclusive, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Try to remember which one you are while you're in the room. The platform I stood on was roughly 10 meters square, suspended in the middle of the chamber by a mechanism I could not identify and had decided not to think too hard about. Around me, at different levels and positions, floated 36 other platforms of varying sizes, each one holding the representatives of a different species. Some of them I could see clearly. Some of them were behind glass or behind environmental barriers. Some of them I could not look at directly because whatever was on their platform was beyond what my brain wanted to categorize in a public setting. I kept my eyes forward and my hands clasped behind my back, and I looked at the center of the chamber, where a raised dais held a figure I had come to understand was the council moderator, a being from a species called the Aerith, tall and slow-moving, with a face built for patience if faces could be built for things. The platform directly across from mine held the Karath delegation. Ambassador Grex Solon was not the admiral. He was, if anything, more composed than the admiral had been, which is to say he was more composed than anyone I had ever met. He was tall and still, in a perfectly fitted uniform, with those same flat pale eyes that gave away nothing. He looked at me the way you look at furniture, not unkindly, just without any of the consideration you extend to things that can look back. He had submitted the Dominion's formal position to the Council before I arrived. I had been given a summary. It covered 3 main points. Humans occupied 3 star systems with no strategic significance. Humans possessed no faster-than-light weapons capability. The Dominion's action against the Endurance had been within established galactic norms for Class II species management, which was a phrase I had added to my ongoing report, with a note that I planned to have opinions about later. The council moderator began the session in a language I did not understand. My earpiece translated. He was establishing the record, confirming representatives, noting that this was an extraordinary session convened at Dominion request, and that the human representative was attending in observer capacity. Observer capacity, I noted that and set it aside. Grex Solon spoke first. He was efficient. He did not waste words, which I respected even while the words themselves were making me want to put my fist through the platform floor. He presented humanity the way you present a mildly interesting geological survey. He cited the 3 star systems. He cited the military capability assessment, which had apparently been compiled over the last 40 years of observation from deep-range probes we had never detected. He cited population figures, technological development curves, and what he called aggression tendency metrics, which as far as I could tell was a number assigned to species based on how often they went to war with themselves. Our number was very high. He presented it without expression. Several of the other delegates shifted on their platforms. I kept my hands behind my back and kept my face neutral and kept breathing. Then Grex Solon reached the recommendation. Humanity represents a manageable risk profile at current development stage, he said. Dominion projection indicates that if left to natural growth, Class 2 species of this aggression tendency rating will achieve faster-than-light capability within 80 to 100 standard cycles. At that stage, the species becomes non-trivial to manage. The Dominion therefore recommends immediate reduction to protected species reservation status, which involves relocation of human population centers to 3 designated systems, limitation of technological development, and Dominion oversight of the reservation boundaries. He paused. This is standard procedure, he said. It has been applied successfully to 14 species. It is, in our assessment, the most efficient resolution to the present situation. The chamber was quiet. The moderator noted the statement for the record. 3 or 4 other delegates asked clarifying questions about the reservation boundary specifications, which they got answers to in calm, practical terms. Nobody objected. I stood on my platform and breathed and thought about Pete Donnell's photograph and Karen's coffee thermos, drifting in the cold somewhere outside Jupiter's orbit. Then the moderator turned to me. The human observer is granted 3 minutes of address, he said. As a courtesy, I stepped forward. I had thought about what to say. I had thought about it for 6 weeks, in debriefs and in the spare bunk of the transport ship and in the 2 hours before dawn when the station lights were low and the corridor outside my quarters was quiet. I had thought about arguments and appeals and formal statements and the language of diplomacy that I had studied frantically in the weeks leading to this moment. I pulled out my tablet instead, the one from the pod, still cracked. I am going to read you something, I said. This is an excerpt from my after-action report, filed following the Dominion's destruction of the freighter Endurance, on which I was the sole surviving crew member. I could feel Grex Solon watching me. Not differently from before, still like furniture. But watching, I read the names, all 23 of them. Slowly, clearly, every syllable. Karen's name, Pete Donnell's name. The young cargo loader named Owen Cole, 22 years old, from a small town in what used to be Scotland, who had joined the merchant fleet because he wanted to see the solar system, and had apparently seen more of it than he expected. I read all 23 names and then I lowered the tablet. The chamber was still quiet. It was a different kind of quiet. I am not here to negotiate, I said. I am not authorized to negotiate. I am here because you asked for a human representative, and I am apparently the most qualified human for this room, which should tell you something about where we are as a species in terms of galactic diplomatic preparation. A few of the translated murmurs from other platforms suggested that statement landed with some of the delegates. The Karath representative has described humanity accurately in terms of numbers, I said. 3 systems, limited weapons, high aggression tendency, all correct. What the assessment does not include is context, and context is everything when you are trying to predict what a species will do. I looked at Grex Solon. Humanity has been fighting wars for 10,000 years, I said. Not because we enjoy it, though I understand why that aggression number suggests otherwise. Because we could never agree on enough things to stop. Every war we have ever fought, we fought without any backup. No allies outside our own planet, no rescue from somewhere else. Just us, digging in and refusing to stop until the thing was settled one way or another. I paused. We lost a lot of them, I said. Catastrophically. Cities flattened, populations reduced. Entire generations that never got to grow old. And every single time we got back up, not because we are smart, not because we had better weapons, because getting back up is the only response we have ever been able to agree on as a species. Grex Solon had not moved. You are recommending that the Council approve reducing us to a reservation, I said. I am informing you, as a courtesy, that humanity will not accept that outcome. Not because we have the power to stop you right now. We do not. The assessment is accurate on that point. But the assessment is missing the part where we do not stay where we are. We learn, we adapt, and we do not stop. From the edge of my vision, I noticed one of the smaller platforms. On it sat a compact figure in simple clothing, from a species I had not been briefed on. They were watching me with an expression I could not fully read, but which did not look like the boredom or the clinical detachment on every other platform. It looked like something else. I would find out later that they were Veth, that they had been a free people before the Dominion's expansion, that they sat in this chamber not as an ally of the Karath, but because refusal would have cost them more than compliance. At that moment I just saw someone paying attention. The admiral who destroyed my ship told me there was no one to send my report to. I said he was wrong. I sent it anyway. And I am standing here, in front of you, which is apparently what happened as a result. I looked around the chamber. All those platforms, all those species. We are not asking for your help, I said. I want to be clear about that. We are not asking for permission or protection or alliance. We are informing you that we are going to handle this ourselves, the way we have always handled everything, which is messily and expensively, and without any guarantee of success. What happens after that is up to all of you. I stepped back. The moderator noted the address for the record. The vote that followed was, as everyone in the room knew it would be, a decision to remain neutral. 35 of the 37 member species voted to take no position on the matter of humanity's situation. The Karath abstained because they did not need to vote. The remaining abstention came from the small Veth platform. Not a vote against neutrality, just a refusal to endorse it. It was the smallest possible gesture, the kind of thing that does not show up in official records as anything meaningful. I wrote it down. Greg Solan approached me as I stepped off the platform corridor, a thing he did not need to do. He had won the vote. He was under no obligation to speak with me. He stopped 2 meters away and regarded me with those flat, still eyes. You understand, he said, that this changes nothing practically. The Dominion's assessment and its projected actions remain unchanged. I understand, I said. You gave a speech, he said. It was a good speech. It will not alter the military situation. No, I said. It was not for the military situation. He considered that for a moment. Then what was it for? I nodded at the corridor behind him, in the general direction of the Veth platform. Ask them in a year, I said. I walked out. In the corridor outside the chamber, I leaned against the wall for approximately 30 seconds, closed my eyes, and allowed myself to feel everything I had been holding back for the last hour. Not fear. Something more complicated than fear. The weight of 23 names. The weight of what came next. Then I opened my eyes, straightened my shoulder seam. Still not quite right. And started walking toward the docking bay where my transport was waiting. There was more to add to the report. There was always more to add. 14 months after the destruction of the Endurance, I was jammed into a ventilation shaft on a Martian colony the size of a mid-sized town, holding a detonator in one hand and a diagram of the colony's water recycling system in the other, waiting for Corporal Dan Finch to stop arguing with me through the earpiece. You are going to flood the main corridor, Finch said. Yes, I said. With recycled water. It is what we have, Dan. There was a pause on the line. I heard him breathing. Somewhere below me, through the shaft grating, I could hear the movement of Karath armored units pushing through the colony's outer ring. Heavy, deliberate, unhurried. They had 3 full armored columns, air support on standby, and a fleet element in low orbit in case anyone felt like being dramatic about the situation. We had 11 people, a partial power grid, whatever was left in the colony's supply rooms, and a ventilation system that was older than most of the crew. How long do we need to hold? Finch asked. Long enough, I said. That is not a number. 11 days, I said. The relief column is 11 days out. We hold until then, or we give them 11 days of data on Karath ground tactics at 0 cost to the relief column. Either outcome is useful. Another pause. You planned for us not making it, Finch said. I planned for every outcome, I said. The plan where we make it is the one I prefer. But the data is worth collecting regardless. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that I wrote down later because it felt true. He said, you know what the strange thing is? That actually makes me feel better. The thing about fighting a war against a power that is significantly larger than you is that the obvious strategy, direct engagement, matching force with force, is the one you cannot use. So you do not use it. Instead, you use everything else. You use the shafts and the service corridors and the recycling systems and the emergency hatches. You use the fact that the attacking force wants to occupy the colony, not reduce it to rubble, which means they have constraints you do not have. You use the fact that every soldier in your unit has spent their entire life in gravity wells and pressurized tunnels and enclosed systems where a human body is the right size for the environment, and where the equipment the Karath are pushing through the corridors is not. They had a tank. It was a beautiful machine, I will grant them that. Multi-directional repulsor system, composite armor, forward weapons array that could take apart a wall in one pass. It was worth approximately 400 million credits, based on the procurement data we had managed to extract from captured Karath communications. It got wedged in the main corridor junction because whoever designed it had not accounted for the fact that human colonial corridors are built to human proportions, not to the proportions of a species that averages half a meter taller. We found out about the wedge when the crew of the tank tried to back it out, failed, and attempted to radio their support column. Owen, Not Owen Cole, a different Owen. Owen Park, 26 years old, former communications tech, had been running interference on their frequencies for 6 hours by that point. The tank crew got static. Owen gave me a thumbs up from across the corridor, which is not a gesture he had invented but one that felt appropriate. I sent 2 people with a portable welding unit they had pulled from the colony maintenance locker. The tank's forward sensor array stopped working 11 minutes later. The official Kareth report, which we obtained 4 months after the engagement, described the incident as novel energy weapon deployment against armored assets. I have the report. I read it to Finch over the VACOM when I got it. We both laughed for longer than was probably healthy. That is the thing about the war in its early phase that nobody talks about enough when they describe it later. They talk about strategy and turning points, and the eventual political realignment of the Hegemony Council. They do not talk about the laughing, not because it was inappropriate, but because laughter in impossible situations does not fit cleanly into the serious historical record, and because the people writing the record later were not in the ventilation shafts. We held the colony for 11 days and 3 hours. We lost 2 people. I wrote their names down. When the relief column broke through the outer perimeter and reached the colony's main hub, the first thing the column commander, a captain named Neil Hurst, who had the kind of face that looked like it was always about to ask a sensible question, said when he found me was, "Command said you held with 11 people. 10 by the end," I said. He looked at me for a moment, then at the state of the colony around us, which was functional but thoroughly improvised in ways that no engineering handbook had anticipated. "The tank," he said. "The welding unit is still in the corridor," I said. "We can write it into the after action as a proof of concept if you want." He blinked. "A proof of concept for what?" "Improvised anti-armor technique," I said. "For the record." He stared at me for another long second. "Yes, ma'am," he said, which seemed to be the appropriate response that soldiers defaulted to when I said things in that particular tone. The broader war, in those first 14 months, looked from the outside like a disaster. The Kareth moved methodically through the outer settlements, hitting the least defended positions first, pushing toward the more significant colony clusters, with the patience of something that had done this before, and expected it to resolve itself within a predictable time frame. They were not wrong to expect that. It was a reasonable expectation based on every other species they had managed this way. What they had not planned for was the cost-to-progress ratio climbing with every engagement. Their initial assessment had projected a 90-day campaign before humanity would enter formal surrender negotiations. At day 90, they had taken 3 outer settlements, lost 47 units of equipment to causes ranging from combat damage to environmental interference to what one report described as unexplained structural failure of multiple systems, and had not reached a single major population center. At day 180, the projection was revised. At day 270, the projection was revised again. I heard about the revisions through channels, captured transmissions, intelligence from sources I was not yet authorized to discuss. Each revision carried the same careful, clinical language the Kareth used for everything, and I could read in the very precision of that language the thing they were not saying directly. The thing was, "This is taking longer than it should." That was not victory. I was careful not to call it victory, but it was data. The Veth were the first to reach us. I say reach us loosely. What actually happened was that 3 Veth engineers, 2 women and 1 man, their names rendered in their own language in forms I could not pronounce and will not attempt to spell here, made contact with our outer signal relay via a modified transmission format that our intelligence desk flagged as potentially significant. It took 12 days to confirm it was not a Kareth trap. It took another 8 days to establish a secure channel. When I finally spoke to the Veth contact, she was calm and direct in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of myself. "We have something you need," she said. "We want nothing in return except to see what you do with it." "Nothing," I said. "We want to see if it is possible," she said, "to stop them." I thought about that. "And if we fail? Then we have lost nothing we did not already consider lost," she said. "And we will have seen something no one has seen in 400 years." "What's that?" I said. "A real fight," she said. She sent us the shield harmonics. The entire Kareth defensive shield system, frequencies, cycling patterns, resonance vulnerabilities, packaged in a data format so clean and well organized that our weapons engineers, when they first opened it, thought it was a fabrication because no intelligence package was ever that tidy. It took 6 weeks to develop a warhead that could use the information. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of weapon that would end up in a museum someday as an example of brilliant engineering. It was, by the honest assessment of the team that built it, A rough solution held together by ingenuity and deadline pressure. It worked. The first test was against a Kareth-heavy cruiser that moved into engagement range of a human destroyer group near the outer belt. The destroyers were outmassed, outgunned, and running on the assumption that this was going to be a bad day in a long series of bad days. Then the torpedo hit the cruiser amidships, punched through the shield that should have stopped it cold, and did the damage it was supposed to do. The cruiser pulled back, not destroyed, not even crippled, but it pulled back, which was something no Kareth vessel had done in the entire 14-month war. The destroyer group's captain sent a single-line transmission up the chain. It said that worked. I was in a briefing room when the transmission came through. Someone passed it to me on a screen. I read it. I put the screen down, I breathed. Then I wrote it in the report. The official Kareth communication to their high command, intercepted and decoded 3 months later, described the torpedo incident as anomalous, and requested a full technical review of shield system integrity. The review, by the time we saw it, had already been escalated twice. The language remained clinical, as it always did, precise and measured, but somewhere in the careful, formal Kareth phrasing, under the layers of military protocol and species pride, I could read the shape of a feeling they did not have a word for in the translation database. I had a word for it, surprise panic not yet. But surprise, and under the surprise, something just beginning to sharpen at the edges, something that in a human would have looked like the moment you stop assuming the outcome and start paying attention to the actual situation in front of you. I made note of it. In the Hegemony Council chamber, 2 days after the torpedo test results circulated through the intelligence networks of 15 different species, there was a 48-hour period of unusual quiet. No formal communications, no session announcements, nothing moving through the standard diplomatic channels. I heard about it from Neil Hurst, who had sources I did not have. They are talking to each other, he said. All of them. About us, I said. About what it means, he said. What does it mean? He was quiet for a moment. I think, he said slowly, that it means the footnote is becoming something else. I thought about that. Don't say it, I said. I wasn't going to say anything, he said. Good, I said. Because it is not time yet, it was not. 14 months in, 2 good pieces of news. A war that was still very much ongoing and very much costly, and the beginning of something I was not ready to name. But it was real. The thing Grex Solon had dismissed in the council chamber, the thing the Admiral had laughed at in that first transmission, was real, and it was building, and the galaxy was starting to notice. And in a ventilation shaft in a Martian colony, in the cold and the dark and the recycled air, 11 people had held a line. That was where the real story lived. Not in the transmission logs or the diplomatic communiques or the fleet engagement reports. In the shafts. In the laughing. In the specific stubborn fact of a welding torch, sitting in a corridor next to a 400 million credit piece of military hardware that would never move again. I wrote that down too. 2 years, 1 month, and 11 days after the Endurance was destroyed, I sat in a transport bay on the edge of the new Carthage colony and read a list of names. My own people, 19 of them. The transport bay had been a supply depot before the Kareth orbital strike that morning. Now it was a structure with 3 walls and a roof, and a view of a sky that was still hazy with the residue of what had come down from above. I had been in the medical unit when it happened, 2 stitches above my left eye from a debris hit the previous day. The medical unit was underground, which is the only reason I was reading the list instead of on it. I read every name twice. Then I closed the tablet and sat with my hands on my knees and stared at the floor for a long time. I did not write an after-action report that day. I did not write one the next day either. On the 3rd day I wrote one. It was the shortest one I had ever filed. It was also the most accurate, because by that point I had run out of the energy required to be anything other than completely truthful. I wrote that the engagement had been conducted correctly. I wrote that the unit had performed at a standard that exceeded any reasonable expectation given the conditions. I wrote that the orbital strike that ended the engagement was not a response to anything the unit had done wrong. It was a change in Kareth tactics, a shift from ground-based occupation strategy toward punitive aerial operations, which represented a significant escalation and, more importantly, a significant change in intent. They were no longer trying to occupy us cleanly. I wrote that down. Then I wrote what it meant. An occupying force that switches to punitive operations is an occupying force that has stopped believing occupation will work. It is a force that has moved from a plan to a reaction, and a force that is reacting is a force that has lost the initiative. I sent the report up the chain. Then I sat with it for another day, the meaning of it turning over in the back of my mind, while the rest of my mind was still standing in that transport bay reading names. The war was changing, not turning, not yet, but changing, which was a different thing, and, in some ways, more important, because turning points are things you recognize in retrospect, while changes are things you can feel as they happen, if you are paying close enough attention. The Veth contact, the woman whose name I could not pronounce and had taken to writing in my notes as simply V, reached me 3 days after New Carthage. Her transmission was shorter than usual. 6 more species, she says, not committed. But watching. What changed, I said. The orbital strike, she said. The Dominion does not use punitive strikes on Class 2 species during standard reduction campaigns. It indicates irregular resource expenditure. They are spending more than they planned, I said. Significantly more, she said. And the other Dominion members have noticed. The thing about an empire, the structural thing that people who have never lived inside one sometimes miss, is that it is not a unified thing. It looks unified from outside. One flag, one fleet, one set of policies applied consistently across every world they touch. But from inside, it is a collection of deals and arrangements and implied agreements, all of which are held together by the assumption that the center is strong enough to enforce them. When the center starts spending irregular resources on problems that were supposed to be trivial, the other parts of the empire start doing arithmetic. And arithmetic at that scale is dangerous. V was telling me that the arithmetic had started. What do they need to commit? I said evidence, she said. Not just that you can resist, that you can make it cost enough that resistance becomes a rational choice for others. We need a win, I said. You need a visible one, she said. The torpedo was significant but contained. Something at larger scale. I thought about that for a long moment. I have a request, I said. I assumed you would, she said. Not weapons data this time, I said. I need logistics, supply chain maps, where the Dominion routes materials to the front. She was quiet for a moment. You want to hit their supply structure, she said. I want to know where to look, I said. We will find the rest. It took 3 weeks to get the maps. In those 3 weeks, the Hegemony Council was convened in emergency session. Not at the Karath's request this time, but at the request of 5 member species who had submitted a joint formal inquiry into the escalation of the current campaign against what they called, in the formal language of the Council, a developing species of note. I was invited back, not as an observer this time. The invitation specified representative status, which meant a seat, which meant a vote, which meant something had shifted in the official math of how the Council was counting things. I wore the same uniform. I got the shoulder seam right this time. Grex Solon was already in the chamber when I arrived. He watched me cross to my platform with an expression that had changed from the first session. Not much, but enough to notice. The boredom was gone. In its place was something that I recognized from debriefs with officers who had just received information that did not fit their existing model of a situation. He was recalibrating. The session was formal and long, and covered many items I will not detail here because they involve the internal political arrangements of species whose situations I do not have the authority to speak for. What I will say is that by the end of it, the Karath's request to have the Council formally endorse the ongoing reduction campaign was denied, not countered, not overturned, denied, which meant the Council declined to vote on it at all, which, in the formal language of the body, meant that no consensus existed on the matter, which meant the Dominion was operating without the Council's political backing for the first time in over a century. It was a small thing. It would not stop a single Karath ship. It would not bring back anyone on the list I had read in that ruined supply depot. But it was a crack, hairline thin, in something that the Dominion had assumed was solid. Grex Solon approached me after the session. You have been building this, he said, since the first council session. Yes, I said. The speech was not for the vote, he said. The vote was always going to be neutral. The speech was for the other species in the room. Yes, I said. He was quiet for a moment, which for Grex Solon was the equivalent of a long and searching conversation. You are more sophisticated than the initial assessment suggested, he said. The initial assessment was based on 40 years of watching us from a safe distance, I said. You learned the language, you did not learn the people. He considered that. The supply chain maps, he said quietly. You have them. I kept my expression exactly where it was. I don't know what you're talking about, I said. He held my gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked away, and the set of his shoulders told me what I needed to know, which was that he knew, and that knowing it was already a problem for him. Good. The combined strike on the Karath supply hub at Corridor 7. I am using the human designation, not the Karath one, which I cannot reproduce accurately, was the first offensive operation of the war. Not defensive, not a holding action. An actual, deliberate initiated strike, using a joint force of human destroyers and 2 Veth-sourced intelligence assets that provided real-time guidance on the patrol schedules. It was not clean, I want to be precise about that. It was not clean, it did not go exactly as planned. It cost more than the projection said it would, and in the post-operation debrief, 4 separate things went wrong that had not been anticipated, and 2 things went right that also had not been anticipated. And the net result of all of it was that the hub was neutralized, and the fleet withdrew intact. Not elegant, not a monument to military precision, just effective. The Karath High Command's response was a formal ceasefire inquiry, submitted through diplomatic channels to Earth's government, requesting preliminary discussions. I heard about it while I was writing the after-action report for Corridor 7. Neil Hurst brought me the message in person, which he only did when something was significant enough that he wanted to see my face when I read it. I read it, I put it down. Well, I said, he said. I picked up the message again and read it a second time more slowly. They want to talk, I said. They want to talk, he confirmed. I thought about the Admiral on the screen in the pod, the flat pale eyes, the laugh. I thought about 19 names. I thought about 23 names before that. I thought about Pete Donnell's photograph in Karen's coffee and Owen Cole, who had wanted to see the solar system. Set up a channel, I said. Let them know we are prepared to receive a formal inquiry. Just like that, Neil said. Not just like that, I said. But yes, he nodded, started to leave, then stopped at the door. Mara, he said, which was a thing he almost never called me. Do you think this is it? I looked at the ceasefire message. I looked at the after-action report beside it. I looked at the crack in the corner of my tablet screen. Still there, still the same crack from the pod. I think, I said carefully, that it is the beginning of the part where we decide what it is. He absorbed that. Then he nodded again and left, and I sat alone with the 2 documents on the table in front of me, the report of a fight, and the request to stop having them, and I thought about all of it for a long time. Then I started writing. The room where you end a war does not look like anything in particular. I had expected something, if I am honest. Some weight to the architecture, some echo of the significance of the occasion in the way the furniture was arranged, or the way the light came through the windows. I had spent 2 years and almost 4 months in corridors and shafts and ruined depots and the cramped cockpits of transport ships, and somewhere in the back of my mind I had formed a picture of what the other end of all of it would look like. It looked like a conference room. Long table, neutral walls, chairs that were reasonably comfortable by the standards of people who had not recently slept in ventilation shafts. The windows looked out over a landing platform where 3 shuttles sat at rest. Ours, the Karath delegations, and a Hegemony Council observer vessel that had arrived without announcement and been permitted to stay on the grounds that their presence might be useful to the record. My name is Mara Voss. I was a staff sergeant. I am now a colonel, which is a promotion I received 4 times in the last 2 years in a process that I had very little input into and was mostly too busy to acknowledge properly. I sat at one end of the conference table with 2 generals, 1 diplomat, and a legal analyst named Clara Webb, who had been awake for 36 hours and was holding a cup of coffee like it was the only anchor keeping her connected to the physical world. Across the table sat the Karath delegation, 4 of them. Grex Solon was not the head of it. That was a Karath official I had not met before, a figure called Senior Voice Venereth, whose title translated roughly as Chief Negotiator, and whose demeanor translated even more roughly as someone who would very much prefer to be somewhere else. Grex Solon was the second seat. He looked at me when he sat down, and I looked at him, and then we both looked at the table. We had been looking at the table together, metaphorically speaking, for 2 years. The first 3 days of negotiation were technical. Ceasefire boundaries, monitoring protocols, the status of territories currently under dispute. Clara Webb handled most of it because that was her actual job, and she was formidably good at it in the specific focused way of someone who does not let tiredness change the quality of the work. I sat and listened and spoke when I was asked to speak and let the process be the process, because the process existed for a reason, and I had spent enough time working outside it to genuinely appreciate it when it was available. On the 4th day, we reached the question of terms. Ven Areth presented the Karath position, which was that the ceasefire should be formalized as a bilateral non-aggression arrangement, with both parties returning to pre-conflict boundaries and agreeing to a 10-year moratorium on military development beyond the current threshold. It was, as far as these things went, a reasonable offer. It was the kind of offer you made when you wanted the other side to feel that they had gotten something while you preserved everything that actually mattered. Clara Webb began to draft a counterposition. I leaned over and said quietly, I have the 3. She looked at me over her coffee cup. The 3 things, I said. The ones I want in the final document. She had been briefed on this. She had been briefed on it, and she had argued against it at length 6 weeks before in a room full of generals and diplomats, all of whom had concerns about its feasibility and its diplomatic impact, and the long-term relationship implications of entering a negotiation with demands rather than flexibility. I had listened to all of it. Then I had said that these 3 things were not negotiable, and that everything else was. She had filed the paperwork accordingly. She said now, across the coffee cup, "Are you sure this is the moment?" "Yes," I said. She put the cup down and presented the 3 terms. Humanity required permanent, irrevocable recognition of human sovereignty across all currently settled and future settled systems. Not a negotiated boundary, not a renewable arrangement. A permanent, recorded, council-witnessed acknowledgement that humanity was a recognized sovereign entity in galactic space. Not a Class II managed species, not a protected reservation, and not subject to any form of dominion oversight or reclassification. The room was quiet. Humanity required the immediate and complete release of all species currently under dominion obligation contracts. The formal designation for what was, in plain language, a controlled status that limited a species' political and economic independence. This included the Veth and 11 other species across Dominion space. It was not a demand for the Dominion's dissolution. It was a demand that the practice stop, effective immediately for everyone under it. The room was very quiet, and humanity required 1 permanent seat on the Hegemony Council, non-removable, non-conditional, held in perpetuity as a full voting member. Van Aerith looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, in the careful, measured Kareth way that I had come to read quite well, "These terms are broad." "Yes," Clara said. "The second item," he said, "the obligation contracts. You understand that this is not a bilateral matter. This touches 37 member species of the Dominion." "Yes," Clara said. "You are asking us to restructure the framework of our internal governance in exchange for ending a conflict with a species that—" He stopped. "That what?" I said, because that was the part I wanted on the record. He looked at me. "A species that should not, by reasonable assessment, have been able to produce this outcome," he finished. "Reasonable assessment," I said. "That is in the report I filed from the escape pod. Someone told me there was no one to send it to." Van Aerith glanced at Greg Salon, who was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a person reviewing a very long internal document. "The terms are accepted," Van Aerith said. The words sat in the air of the conference room for a moment before anyone moved. Clara put her coffee down very carefully. One of the generals exhaled through his nose in a way that was not quite a sound. I wrote it down. We were not done. There were 40 more hours of session work to convert the acceptance into a formal document, with all the specific language and cross-referenced provisions and witnessed signatures that a legal instrument of that scale required. Clara Webb worked through most of it without sleeping, and I sat beside her for enough of it to be a useful presence. And at various points over those 40 hours I thought about many things. I thought about the ventilation shaft on Mars and Finch arguing with me through the earpiece. I thought about Owen Park giving a thumbs up in the corridor beside a tank that would never move again. I thought about V and the Veth and the clean, careful data package that had started everything changing. I thought about Neil Hurst standing in a ruined colony entrance with a question he had not expected to need to ask. I thought about the Hegemony Council chamber, a sphere large enough to hold a small city, and the Veth delegate on the small platform who had refused to vote for neutrality. I thought about 23 names and 19 names, and all the names in between. On the final day, after the document was complete and the signatures were applied, and the council observer had recorded everything as required by their protocol, the delegations filed out in stages. The Kareth left first, which was fine. There was no ceremony required, no formal handshake, no photograph. The document existed. It was enough. When the room was mostly empty, Greg Salon appeared in the doorway. He had not left with the others. He stood there for a moment, looking at me across the length of the conference table. And then he walked back in and stood on the other side of it and said nothing for a while. I waited. "I want to understand something," he said. "Ask," I said. "In the escape pod," he said. "When you told the Admiral that he had started a war he could not win. You did not know that. At that moment, by any rational assessment, you did not know any such thing." "No," I said. "So what was it?" he said. "A threat? A performance?" "I thought about that. When you are falling," I said, "and there is no floor in sight, you do not know whether you will land safely. You genuinely do not know, but you already know what you are going to do when you hit. Because there is no version of you that stops trying after the landing. There is just the trying, over and over, for as long as the trying is possible. He was quiet. The Admiral thought that not knowing the outcome would stop me, I said. It never occurred to him that not knowing the outcome was completely irrelevant to the decision. He looked at me for a long moment. No, he said slowly. It would not have occurred to us. He left. I sat alone in the conference room with the signed document in front of me. Through the window, I could see the Kareth shuttle lifting from the landing platform, rising smoothly into the afternoon sky. On the table, my tablet. The cracked one, the one from the pod. I opened it. The after-action report was still there. Still labeled, First Contact Incident, Freighter Endurance. The document I had started typing in a closet-sized pod while the debris of the ship spread out behind me, and the recyclers hummed, and the protein bar sat in my pocket tasting like nothing good. I scrolled to the bottom. There was a line there, blank, waiting. I typed the final entry. Status, resolved. Date filed, 2 years, 4 months, and 3 days following the initial incident. I noted, in the formal record, that the delay in filing was due to operational requirements. I noted that the delay would likely be flagged by the administrative system and assigned a procedural note. Then I closed the report and sent it. Outside, the Kareth shuttle was a point of light against the sky, getting smaller. In the doorway, Neil Hurst appeared, looking at me with an expression that was trying very hard not to be what it was, which was everything a person feels when something they thought was impossible has turned out to be real. Done, he said. Filed, I said. He nodded. He stayed in the doorway. What now, he said. I picked up the tablet. The crack in the screen ran across the corner, a thin white line bisecting the lower edge. The same crack it had always been from the same moment it had always come from. I had been offered a new tablet 6 times in the last 2 years. I had declined 6 times. I did not entirely know why, except that the crack felt like it was part of the record, and the record needed to be accurate. Now, I said, we figure out what a permanent seat on the Hegemony Council means and what we are going to do with it. He absorbed that. He almost smiled. That sounds like a lot of reports, he said. Every word, I said. I stood up. The chair scraped back on the floor of the conference room, in the building where the war had ended. In the ordinary, unremarkable room where 2 species had finally looked at each other across a table, without the table, meaning something other than what a table is supposed to mean. I walked toward the door. In my pocket, the cracked tablet. On it, 40 reports, hundreds of entries, 23 names, 19 names, and all the names in between. Finch's voice in the earpiece, V's clean, careful data, the welding torch, the tank, the Veth delegate on the small platform, not voting, just watching. All of it, exactly as it happened. The scar above my ear had healed mostly. The one on my chin, from a bar fight on Titan years before any of this, was still exactly what it had always been. I left that part out of the report. Some things are yours to keep.